Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, great scholars, great leaders. Advocate Ntsebeza, thank you so much for joining us. I remember you many years ago, I think, but around 96, 7, you remember a human rights organization was in Pretoria called National Institute of Public Interest Law and Research, NIPILA. I was one of the executive directors there. I was working there, and you used to be a board member there. So thank you so much, really, for joining us. Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza holds different degrees, include BA from University of South Africa, and LLB from what used to be called UNITRA, now which is called Walter Sisulu University. And also he holds an LLM, that's a master's degree in international law from UCT. In 2007, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza SC became the very first Black non-executive chairman of Barloworld, a multinational conglomerate, which at that time was operating in more than 40 countries around the world. In 2007, actually, Barloworld was celebrating its 105 years of existence. I remember so vividly when Advocate Ntsebeza was a chairperson of Barloworld. Prior to that, Advocate Ntsebeza SC had served on the Barloworld board as one of the handful of Black people on a mainly white male-dominated board. In the dozen-odd years that he was at the helm, the company underwent such radical and fundamental transformative changes that it is now headed by an African female whom he deliberately nominated as his successor, but who was unanimously recommended for chairmanship after having been interviewed by a panel of Barloworld members of the board. Barloworld, under his stewardship, has become a typical, if rare, diverse public listed company whose demography truly reflects South Africa in terms of race and gender. He stepped down from Barloworld at the company's AGM that was in February 2020, leaving behind a better company that he had found 20 years before. And Advocate Ntsebeza SC is also the chairman of Equilaw Limited, an alternative dispute resolution public company that used to be called the Arbitration Forum. He completed his studies for a law degree while serving a 5.5-year-long prison term, which included about 18 months of detention in solitary confinement, awaiting trial period, trial, conviction, and sentence on the 31st of August 1977. He had been held in jail for all that period for political activism in the 70s. He rose to prominence, as most of you remember, in the 90s as commissioner and head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's investigative unit. And Advocate Ntsebeza, on several short-term periods, has served as an acting judge of the High Court of South Africa and of the Labour Court, and has written several judgments which have been reported widely in the South African criminal law reports, etc. He, however, remains a practicing advocate and holds chambers in Sandton, Johannesburg, as the current group leader of the Pan-African Bar Association of South Africa, which is called PABASA. He also is a trained and accredited arbitrator and commercial mediator. He is an erstwhile trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation since 2000 and has been the chairman of the Desmond Tutu Peace Trust before it became Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. He also holds chairmanship of several other organizations and companies, private and public, and serves mainly in other public interest human rights institutions as an ordinary board member. In 2004, pursuant to Resolution 1564 of the United Nations Security Council, adopted on 18 September 2004, Advocate Ntsebeza SC was appointed by the then United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan to serve as a commissioner on the United Nations International Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Violations in Darfur, that is in Sudan. In 2005, Advocate took silk and became the first African in the history of the Cape Bar to be awarded the status of senior counsel by the then President of the Republic of South Africa, that is President Thabo Mbeki. Advocate has had several leadership positions in the legal profession, including being the founder member of, and first president of the National Association of Democratic Lawyers, which is called NADEL, the president and subsequently the deputy president of the Black Lawyers Association, a member of the Cape and Johannesburg Bar Councils, and is now the immediate past national chairman of the Advocate for Transformation. From 2009 to 2017, he served as a member of the Judicial Service Commission, which is called JSC, having been nominated to that position by the then President of the Republic of South Africa, President Jacob Gedleyihlekisa Zuma. Whilst he was in the JSC, he also served as the JSC's official spokesperson. Advocate Ntsebeza SC is married with 3 children and enjoys reading, going to gym, swimming, and music. We are so glad to welcome you. You may address us now. You are welcome. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I don't know whether I will be able to rise to the occasion, having heard what you have been saying about Ntsebeza. But as I indicated in the title, it is the case studies that will bring out what one hopes would be indicative of what the attributes of leadership, the kind of leadership we are talking about, are. I may just catalog some of the attributes that really would make a leader the kind of ethical and, reliable leader that, should be leading those who follow. Without dealing with them, each one of them to a full extent, I think it is critical that any leader must have integrity. Integrity means a lot of things to a lot of people, but integrity speaks for itself. A leader who cannot be trusted because the leader doesn't have any integrity cannot be the kind of leader that we are Then there is honesty. Honesty and integrity are not mutually exclusive, but honesty goes so far as to, redefine what integrity is. If you do not, get known to be an honest person, then you are not going to find it easy to lead any people. Let's look around. Those people who have since turned out to be things that they had never, or things that they said they would be but did not become, are dishonest people. And if you are a dishonest person, you can't expect to lead anyone. Even if you wave a panga and you chase people around because you have been caught out. Now, another aspect or another attribute is reliability. People must be able to rely on what a leader says. If people cannot rely on what you say, then it is not going to be possible for that person to lead. And linked to reliability is trustworthiness. Anything a person who seeks to lead a group of people, anything that person says, but which does not leave those who are listening or those whom he or she is leading with any measure of comfort, is clearly not going to be the kind of leader that we hope to be talking about today. Secondly, fifthly, one of the attributes is considerateness. A true leader should be one who takes time to consider whatever is being put before him or her. And having done the consideration, then the person must show a level of considerateness. And that means subtly that one must have taken into account certain things that inform him or her from what he or she has been approached about for purposes of taking the lead in a venture in relation to which he needs to show that considerateness. And sixthly, a leader of the nature that we are looking at tonight must be a man or a woman of his or her word. There is nothing that gives anyone, let alone a leader, the respect that that leader will get if that leader is a man or a woman of his or her word. One who wants to lead in an ethical fashion must be one whose word is going to be relied upon and whose word is as good as gold. Seventhly, there must be a propensity to speak the truth. Sometimes people say, because you were in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you think that everything must be determined on the basis of whether or not it is the truth. But unfortunately, there is a need for people in society to speak the truth, because it is only when the truth, which has been examined by those who have been told is the truth, is going to carry the day. Otherwise, if a leader is not prone to speak the truth, which is why one was saying there is an interconnectedness with these values. But when you are a leader, you must have that propensity to speak the truth. But one of the other further attributes is the ability to listen. Some of the greatest leaders in our society here and in the world at large are people who are always credited for having been very good listeners. Those who know Mandela, Udalbong, and have been in his presence in one moment or another. You might even sometimes believe that he was not listening at all because he was not prone to interrupt. He would, at the most times, listen as though he is not hearing what you are saying. And it is only when he replies that you begin to appreciate that he was listening. And in the debates that you know, in the debates with the late former President de Klerk, and in the debates that he had with Ted Koppel in that famous, hearing in the US where he defended, his association with leaders which the United States was not comfortable that he was that he was a friend of your Gaddafi's, about whom I'm going to talk just in a moment, your Fidel Castro, etc., etc. And he had a very good point as to why, notwithstanding their unpopularity with the Western world, they nevertheless were, friends of the liberation movement, and he gave reasons why. Now, and as I say, a number of people attribute that to his ability to sit and listen. And those of us who have watched that Ted Koppel, now and again, will attest to the fact that even when there are people from the crowd who are asking questions, who were insulting him, he kept his cool, and then it was only in the response that one was able to appreciate that he had been listening, he heard, and he was in a position to respond. The next aspect that I am thinking of is consultation. In fact, as I was driving home, there was a dispute as to whether consultation should have taken place more than it did. But I'm not going to go into that because it's internal politics in the Republic of South Africa between members of the Government of National Unity, as it is called. And so it is not my place to refer to that. But the point I'm making here is that a leader is one who leads because he is able to consult. And there is a slight difference in the manner of the consultation. A leader does not necessarily need to act because he had been in consultation with those he wants to lead in a particular endeavor. It is enough that the leader has taken a decision after consultation. Because, of course, you see, if the matter is done in consultation, it means there must be clarity as to whether the leader had taken into account all of the things that had been put to him or her by the person or persons with whom he had been in consultation. So consultation, even if it is consultation of the nature where the leader does what he does after consultation, the mere fact that there was that kind of consultation goes a long way. And I think lastly, but not in the least, before I then go to deal with whom I consider, in the light of what I've said, will be case studies. A leader must be able to say sorry. A leader must be prepared to say, I made a mistake. I need to be forgiven. I made an error of judgment. The mere fact that one is a leader does not necessarily mean that one knows it all. Or even if one has got a vastness of knowledge, it does not mean that one cannot make a mistake. It does not mean that there is no room for one to admit that somebody else could have done it better, or had he or she taken time to consider all the other aspects, perhaps he or she would have come to a different conclusion. And therefore, to the extent that he or she had not done so, then to that extent, he or she must be prepared and be willing to say, I am sorry. Now, lastly, a leader must be prepared to sacrifice. And as we know, in the famous words of Holy Hlahla, when they were facing the death sentence in the Rivonia trial, it was very noble and very courageous of him, given the nature of the charges that they were facing, given the sentences that were prescribed. It was very courageous of him to say, for these values and for what I have always been dreaming, I am prepared to die. It's not something that we should take very lightly. Because when a person says they are prepared to die, one must think, because you see, with death, which is why some of us are very much against the imposition of the death sentence. If a judge has made a mistake in imposing the death sentence, or has made a mistake in the understanding of the law, or has made a mistake in appreciating the evidence, and because there is a mandatory, or because the sentence is the imposition of the death sentence, and the person is executed, even if it is an hour thereafter that it becomes discovered that there's been a huge mistake, the nature of which led to the execution of somebody who was actually present, it doesn't really matter, because at that stage, the person will have been executed. But I'm digressing because I am simply making the point that when one considers the time and when one considers what was in store for the Rivonia 10, you know, when Mandela said he is prepared to die for these beliefs, you know, and his values, it was a very brave thing to say. And I say it was because he was the leader. Those whom he led at the Rivonia trial must have felt, if Madiba is prepared to die, who are we not to be able to do that sacrifice? Now, that is, in a nutshell, some of the things that I thought we should take into account when we look at what are the attributes, you know, of a responsible and ethical leadership. And against that backdrop, please allow me, Prof. Majola, to do a case study. And I've chosen for a case study, and deliberately so, someone who we all know, who died under very, controversial circumstances, and whose leadership and leadership style had caused a great deal of controversy. It's either you hated him or you liked him. That person was Muammar Gaddafi. Now, Muammar Gaddafi came into politics as via a coup. And it is very interesting what they said in 1969, justifying the coup d'etat. People of Libya, in response to your own will, fulfilling your most heartfelt wishes, answering your most incessant demands for change and regeneration, and your longing to strive towards these ends, listening to your incitement to rebel, your armed forces have undertaken the overthrow of the corrupt regime, the stench of which has sickened and horrified us all. At a single blow, our gallant army has toppled these idols and has destroyed their images. By a single stroke, it has lightened the long dark night in which the Turkish domination was followed first by Italian rule, then by this reactionary and decadent regime, which was no more than a hotbed of extortion, faction, treachery, and treason. That is what he said in a radio speech after they had seized power in 1969. And so when once Gaddafi had removed the monarchical government, he announced the foundation of what he called the Libyan Arab Republic. And addressing the populace by radio, he proclaimed an end to the reactionary and corrupt regime, the stench of which has sickened and horrified us all. The things that I have read to be what he had said. Now, having moved into power, he then, in June 1973, created a political ideology as a basis for what he called the Popular Revolution, and he called it the Third International Theory. This approach regarded both the US and the Soviet Union as imperialists and thus rejected Western capitalism as well as Marxist-Leninist atheism. And in this respect, it was similar to the three worlds theory developed by the Chinese political leader Mao Zedong. But the point here is that Gaddafi summarized what he called the Third International Theory in three short volumes published between 1975 and 1979, collectively known as the Green Book. Volume 1 of the Green Book was devoted to the issue of democracy, outlining the flaws of representative systems in favor of direct participatory GPCs. GPCs were General People's Committees. The second dealt with Gaddafi's beliefs regarding socialism, whilst the third explored social issues regarding the family and the tribe. While the first two volumes advocated radical reform, the third adopted a socially conservative stance, proclaiming that while men and women were equal, they were biologically designed for different roles in life. During the years that followed, Gaddafi adopted quotes from the Green Book, such as "representation is fraud," as slogans. Meanwhile, in September 1975, Gaddafi implemented further measures to increase popular mobilization, introducing objectives to improve the relationship between the councils and the AFCO. Now, so he had this, theory of his, and he says it was socialism. Now, a little research I made here says if socialism is defined as a redistribution of wealth and resources, a socialist revolution clearly occurred in Libya after 1969, and most especially in the second half of the 1970s. The management of the economy was increasingly socialist in intent and effect, with wealth in housing, capital, and land significantly redistributed or in the process of redistribution. Private enterprise was virtually eliminated, largely replaced by a centrally controlled economy. Libya turned towards socialism. In March 1978, the government issued guidelines for housing redistribution, attempting to ensure every adult owned their own home. Most families were banned from owning more than one house, while former rental properties were expropriated by the state and sold to the tenants at a heavily subsidized price. In 1979, the committees began the redistribution of land in the Jafara Plain, continuing through 1981. In May 1980, measures to redistribute and equalize wealth were implemented. Anyone with over 1,000 dinar, which was the currency at the play, in their bank account, saw that extra money expropriated. The following year, the GPC, the one I've indicated, announced that the government would take control of all import, export, and distribution functions, with state supermarkets replacing privately owned businesses. This led to a decline in the availability of consumer goods and the development of a thriving black market. Gaddafi was frustrated by the slow pace of social reform on women's issues, and in 1979 launched a revolutionary women's formation to replace the more gradualist Libyan General Women's Federation. In 1978, he had established a women's military academy in Tripoli, encouraging all women to enlist for training. The measure was hugely controversial and was voted down by the GPC in February 1983. But Gaddafi remained adamant, and when it was again voted down by the GPC in March 1984, he refused to abide by the decision, declaring that he who opposes the training and emancipation of women is an agent of imperialism, whether he likes it or not. Now, that was Muammar Gaddafi for you, justifying, if not by persuasion, then by threat of violence of his armed forces, those who oppose him. He considered that his ideas were a revolution within a revolution. In the late 1980s, there were a series of liberalizing economic reforms within Libya, which were designed to cope with the decline in oil revenues. In May 1987, Gaddafi announced the start of the revolution within a revolution. In June, Libya's government issued the Great Green Charter on Human Rights in the Era of the Masses, in which 27 articles laid out goals, rights, and guarantees to improve the situation of human rights in Libya, restricting the use of the death penalty and calling for its eventual abolition. Many of the measures suggested in the charter would be implemented the following year, although others remained inactive. Also in 1980, the government founded the Al-Gaddafi International Prize for Human Rights to be awarded to figures from the Third World who had struggled against colonialism and imperialism. The first year's winner was South African anti-apartheid activist, Comrade Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. And from 1994 through to 1997, the government, Libyan government, initiated cleansing committees to root out what he regarded as corruption, particularly in the economic sector. Now, what was driving him as a leader? What was his philosophy of life, which he hoped as a leader he would influence his followers by? There was a time when he also dealt with Pan-Africanism, reconciliation, and privatization. I'll talk about this mishmash about Gaddafi's views towards the end of this chat. During the final years of the 20th century, Gaddafi was frustrated by the failure of his pan-Arab ideals and the refusal of the Arab world to challenge the international air embargo which had been imposed on Libya. You will know from that aeroplane that was the Lockerbie incident. Now, he increasingly rejected Arab nationalism after that. And he said he was now in favor of Pan-Africanism. In 1998, in an interview, he claimed that, and I quote, "The Arab world is finished." And he expressed his wish for Libya to become, in quote, "a black country." In June 1999, he visited Mandela in South Africa. And you will recall when he came to South Africa and all the sensation were moving from KZN to Johannesburg in style. Now, in 1999, they say he visited Holishlasha, and the following month, he attended the OAU summit in Algiers, calling for greater political and economic integration across the continent and advocating the foundation of a United States of Africa. He became one of the founders of the African Union, initiated in July 2002 to replace the Organization of African Unity. At the opening ceremonies, he called for African states to reject conditional aid from the developed world, a direct contrast to the message of the South African President Thabo Mbeki. There was speculation that Gaddafi wanted to become the AU's first chair, raising concern within Africa that this would damage the Union's international standing, particularly with the West. Things don't change, given the BRICS meeting and everything else that is going on today in Russia. Anyway, I'm digressing. At the third AU summit held in Tripoli, Libya, in July 2005, Gaddafi called for a greater integration, advocating a single AU passport, a common defense system, and a single currency, using the slogan, "The United States of Africa is the hope." His proposal for a union of African states, a project originally conceived in Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s, was rejected at the 2001 Assembly of Heads of States and Government, the summit that was held in Lusaka by African leaders who thought this proposal by Gaddafi was unrealistic, was utopian. But Libya in 2005 joined the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa called COMESA. In March 2008 in Uganda, he gave a speech once again urging Africa to reject foreign aid. In August 2008, he was proclaimed King of Kings by a committee of traditional African leaders. They crowned him in February 2009 in a ceremony held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That same month, Gaddafi was elected as the chairperson of the African Union, a position he retained for 1 year, and in October 2010, he apologized to African leaders for the historical enslavement of Africans by the Arab slave trade. So you see, a busy leader who was here, there, and everywhere, who felt that he was larger than life. He wanted virtually to be the leader of everything else. I have touched on the question of how Libya was made to pay $2.7 billion to the families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombing, as it was the condition the US and the UK had made for terminating the remaining United Nations sanctions. Of course, Libya continued to deny any role in the bombing. Now, what happened when in 2011? We know that what happened were uprisings in the Arab world called the Arab Spring. And following the start of the Arab Spring in 2011, Gaddafi must have sensed that this thing is going to come to their shores. And as a leader of Libya, he felt that he must do everything to make sure that Libya was not one of the countries that would be swept by the spring, so-called. Now, he is reported to have announced that those rebels who were overthrowing regimes for democracy would be, and this is put in quotes, they would be handed down street by street, house by house, and wardrobe by wardrobe. The army would open fire on protesters, as they did in Benghazi, killing hundreds. Shocked at the government's response, a number of senior politicians resigned or defected to the protesters' side. The uprising spread quickly through Libya's less economically developed eastern half, and by February, eastern cities such as Benghazi, Misrata, Al-Biada, and Tobruk were controlled by the rebels, and the Benghazi and National Transitional Council formed to represent them. And as we know, on the 26th of February, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1970, and that suspended Libya from the United Nations Human Rights Council, implementing sanctions and calling for an international criminal court investigation into the killing of unarmed civilians. In March, the Security Council declared a no-flying zone to protect the civilian population from aerial bombardment, calling on foreign nations to enforce it. It also specifically prohibited foreign occupation. Ignoring this, Qatar sent hundreds of troops to support the dissidents, and along with France and the United Arab Emirates, provided weaponry and military training to the NTC. NATO announced that it would enforce the no-flying zone, and on the 30th of April, a NATO airstrike killed Gaddafi's sixth son and 3 of his grandsons in Tripoli. This Western military intervention was criticized by various leftist governments, including those that had criticized Gaddafi's response to the protest, because they regarded it as an imperialist attempt to secure control of Libya's resources. In June, the ICC issued arrest warrants. This is deja vu. There is an arrest warrant issued for a president who is hosting BRICS as we speak. Yeah, the ICC issued arrest warrants for Gaddafi, his son Saif al-Islam, and his brother-in-law Abdullah Senussi, head of state security. And it was for charges concerning crimes against humanity. That month, Amnesty International also published their report, finding that Gaddafi's forces were responsible for numerous war crimes, but added that the number of allegations of human rights abuses lacked credible evidence. The report added that much Western media coverage has from the outset presented a very one-sided view of the logic of events, portraying the protest movement as entirely peaceful and repeatedly suggesting that the regime's security forces were unaccountably massacring unarmed demonstrators. Now, against that backdrop, then, we look at what Gaddafi was as a leader in public life. According to some researchers, Gaddafi dominated Libya's political life during his period in power. A sociologist, Raymond A. Hinnebusch, described the Libyan as, and I quote, perhaps the most exemplary contemporary case of the politics of charismatic leadership. Others made the following conclusion: a cult of personality devoted to Gaddafi existed in Libya through most of his rule. His biographer, Alison Bargetera, noted that, and I quote, he filled every space, molding the entire country around himself, close quotes. Depictions of his face could be found throughout the country, including on postage stamps, watches, and school satchels. Quotations from the Green Book, that Green Book I talked about, appeared on a wide variety of places, from street walls to airports and pens, and all these were put to pop music for public release. In private, Gaddafi often complained that he disliked this personality cult surrounding him, but that he tolerated it because The people of Libya adored him. The cult served a political purpose, with Gaddafi helping to provide a central identity for the Libyan state. Our Ruth First, who was killed by a bomb at the time that she was a journalist, you will know him, you will know her as having been Slovo's wife or partner, described Gaddafi's speeches as being, in quotes, an inexhaustible flow, didactic, at times incoherent, peppered with snatches of half-formed opinions, admonitions, confidences, some sound common sense, and as much prejudice. Gaddafi's supporters, on the other hand, praised his administration for the creation of a more equal society through domestic reform. They stressed the regime's achievements in combating homelessness, ensuring access to food and safe drinking water, and to dramatic improvements in education. Supporters have also applauded achievements in medical care, praising the universal free health care that was provided under the Gaddafist administration. They also mentioned the availability of free education. They also raised the question of how diseases like cholera and typhoid were contained in Libya under Gaddafi, and life expectancy was raised. Now, his government's treatment of non-Arab Libyans came in for criticism from human rights activists, with native Berbers, Italian colonists, Jews, refugees, and foreign workers all facing persecution in Gaddafist Libya. Human rights groups also criticized his treatment or his regime's treatment of immigrants, including asylum seekers who passed through Gaddafi's Libya when they were on their way to Europe. During the civil war, various leftist groups endorsed the anti-Gaddafist rebels, but not the Western military intervention, by arguing that Gaddafi had become an ally of Western imperialism by cooperating with the war on terror and efforts to block African migration to Europe. Gaddafi was widely perceived as a terrorist, especially in the US and in the UK. Now, the posthumous assessment of Gaddafi is that the international reactions to his death were divided. He was mourned as a hero by many across sub-Saharan Africa, but was widely condemned elsewhere. Having been defeated in the civil war and his system of government having been dismantled and replaced by the interim government of the National Transitional Council, the NTC, which legalized trade unions and freedom of the media. In January 2013, the GNC founded a new political party, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Libya, which was led by Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. The Popular Front was allowed to participate in the future general election. There was a leader that dominated the Libyan space after a coup. Whether or not he is the ethical leader that you at this function are looking for, time will tell. I've said as much as I think I could say. I don't know if I still have any time left, because I just wanted to just touch a leader who also rose to a position of president in Africa, became a Nobel Peace Prize winner against the backdrop of controversies about her position. I would not take more than 5 minutes in dealing with this leader, and then we can have a debate. Prof?
Yes, go ahead, Honorable Justice. It's fine, you can finish.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now, my next leader, whom I considered, was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was born Ellen Eugenia Johnson on the 29th of October, 1938. She is a Liberian leader, a politician who served as the 24th president of Liberia from 2006 to 2018. She has the distinction of being the first elected female head of state in Africa. This happened after Samuel Doe, whom we know, had seized power in a coup in 1980, and who had executed Tolbert, who had been before him. Because of that, Sirleaf fled to the United States, where she worked for a bank, but returned to Liberia to contest a seat in 1985. She was arrested as a result of her open criticism of the military government in 1985 and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, although she was later released, she continued to be involved in politics. She was re-elected in 2011, was the first woman in Africa elected as president of a country. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 in recognition of her efforts to bring women into the peacekeeping process. She has received numerous other awards for her leadership. Now, something comes up because there was a bitter war in Liberia, as you know. And after the end of the Second Liberian Civil War and the establishment of a transitional government, Sirleaf was proposed as a possible candidate for chairman of the government. Sirleaf stood for president as the candidate of a party called the Unity Party in 2005 in that general election. She placed second in the first round of voting behind George Weah, a former footballer, you will know, you will recall him. In the subsequent round of elections, Sirleaf earned 59%, no GNU here, 59% of the vote versus 40% for George Weah, though Weah disputed the results. The announcement of the new leader was postponed until further election investigations were carried out. And on the 23rd of November 2005, Sirleaf was declared the winner of the Liberian election and confirmed as the country's next president and the first woman to be elected as president of an African country. Her inauguration took place on the 16th of January 2006, attended by many foreign dignitaries, including United States Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and the First Lady Laura Bush. Now, you will recall that in 2006, a Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission began work with a mandate to promote national peace, security, unity, and reconciliation by investigating more than 20 years of civil conflict in the country, just like your own TRC. This Liberian TRC was formed through a legislation in 2005 under the interim government headed by C. Guiode Bryant. In their final report, issued in June 2009, the TRC included Sirleaf in a list of 15 names of people that should be, and I quote, specifically barred from holding public offices, elected or appointed for a period of 30 years, close quotes, for, and I quote, being associated with former warring factions. The proposed ban stemmed from her financial support of former President Taylor in the early years of the First Liberian Civil War. On the 26th of July 2009, Sirleaf apologized to Liberia for supporting Charles Taylor, saying, and I quote, "When the true nature of Mr. Taylor's intentions became known, there was no more impassioned critic or strong opponent to him in a democratic process than she." On the 28th of August, the legislature announced that they must consult our constituents for about a year before deciding whether or not to implement the Truth Commission's recommendations. During an appearance at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2010, Sirleaf argued that the implementation of the TRC's recommended ban would unconstitutionally violate her right to the process. In October 2010, the chairman of Sirleaf's Unity Party argued that the implementation of the recommendation of the true TRC would be unconstitutional, as Article 21A of the Constitution prohibits ex post facto laws. In other words, if the law was not there when the offense was committed, then the law was not there. You cannot make the law to be retrospectively applicable. And on that basis, Sirleaf, it was argued, had broken no law by financially supporting Taylor that imposed a ban from public office as the penalty. In 2011, the Supreme Court ruled in Williams versus Starr, a case brought by another person, recommended for being banned from public office in the TRC report, that the TRC's recommendation was an unconstitutional violation of the listed individual's right to procedural due process, and that it would be unconstitutional for the government to implement the proposed bans. Now, I will not go into positions that Sirleaf took on a number of other progressive positions with respect, especially to women's rights. He intervened very, very strongly in relation to the women's rights. She is a member, or let me just take one step back. She also strengthened relations with a wide range of countries, including one of the BRICS members currently in Russia, the People's Republic of China. And she argued that she was reaffirming Liberia's commitment to the One China policy. As you know, a very controversial subject with the United States. In return, China has contributed to Liberia's reconstruction. China has built several transmitters to extend the Liberian broadcasting system nationwide and has constructed a new campus for the University of Liberia. Now, Sirleaf is a member of the Council of Women World Leaders, an international network of current and former women presidents and prime ministers whose mission is to mobilize the highest level women leaders globally for collective action on issues of critical importance to women and equitable development. And this is very interesting, during the 2011 Libyan civil war, Salif added her voice to the international community who asked the previous leader in Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi, to cease the use of violence and tactics of political repression. However, she also criticized the international military intervention in Libya, declaring that, and I quote, "Violence does not help the process, whichever way it comes." Salif's government later severed diplomatic ties with Libya, stating that, and I quote, "The government took the decision after a careful review of the situation in Libya and after determining that the government of Colonel Gaddafi has lost the legitimacy to govern Libya." One last thing about Salif is that upon her inauguration, she promised that she would impose a zero-tolerance policy on corruption within the government. She acknowledged that corruption in major economic reforms or corruption in government remains, noting that zero-tolerance policy was hampered by the need to pass major economic reforms through the legislature, a goal that would have been impeded by significant anti-corruption legislation and prosecutions. However, Salif rejected claims that she has failed to fight corruption, and she pointed to the establishment of the Liberian Anti-Corruption Commission and the restructuring of the General Auditing Commission. Salif dismissed her entire cabinet from office in November 2010, promising to reassemble the cabinet in as short a time as possible. She argued that the move was taken to give her administration a clean slate in preparation for the final year of her term, though critics argued that the move was aimed to bolster her chances at the re-election by confronting corruption in her administration. By early December 2010, she had reconstituted her entire cabinet, replacing 7 of her 19 ministers. This, in brief, are the leaders that I'm putting before us for consideration. What did they have? Did they have all those attributes I started the lecture with? And what are our views about some of the advancements that were made by these leaders? What are our thoughts about the fact that these are leaders, about whom a lot throughout the history of humankind will be said. What about that woman who became the first president, who was the first female president in the continent? Whether or not you are for or against this kind of leadership, I leave that to you. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Advocate and Honorable Justice Ntsebeza. Yeah, wow, sure. What a insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Very interesting that you started with these values and attributes of a responsible and ethical leader. And then after that, you came up with those two case studies, especially of Gaddafi. Someone would have said probably that would have been an oxymoron, looking at these values and then looking at the life of Gaddafi. But obviously, we appreciate the way you painted him, really. There's so many things that you've said or that you've touched on that many people are not aware of. We've just looked at him as this dictator, someone who was authoritarian leader and all sorts of things. But thanks very much for that thought-provoking. Ladies and gentlemen, we can engage now with Honorable Justice Ntsebeza. Obviously, as you know that we are time constrained, but I'll give few if anyone wants to engage or ask questions. While they are coming, Honorable Justice Ntsebeza, there is a view, I remember during those days when really Gaddafi was very strong, promoting the USA, the United States of Africa, that he was very, very pushing it. And there was a view that Thabo Mbeki was against it and other leaders. And there's a view that Gaddafi wanted to was proselyting the continent, wanting the continent, was introducing more Islamic religion, whether by backdoor or whatever. So that's why others were resisting him, obviously, apart from his character. That's the second one. While I was working at Busa, Gaddafi came to South Africa. I don't know if maybe you'll remember this story, Justice Ntsebeza. Gaddafi came to South, probably it was the last, it was during Zuma's tenure when he came.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember which year. And then because Zuma, or rather the President Zuma was busy, he couldn't meet him at the airport, and he deployed or he sent, I can't remember whether it was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, but at that time was a Minister of Foreign Affairs to go and meet him. And then Gaddafi, it is said that Gaddafi was furious. He already didn't want to attend the heads of state meetings the following day, such that President Zuma had to go and meet him at the hotel in Pretoria late at night, just to beg him and to apologize, to say, please, sorry that I couldn't come, but then just to pacify the situation. So there are stories about Gaddafi. As I'm saying that, do you think from your side that really he was an ethical leader, based on what you've told us, and also that he was a responsible leader, a leader that models and a leader that we could, many people could learn a lot from him, based on what he did. Those would just be my questions to you, as I invite colleagues to then ask the question to you. Would you like to respond to that one, Honorable Justice, and then we can take more questions? Thank you.
Yes. I suppose, it should be something that would beg various answers depending on what informs one's outlook in life. There are those who, were Africanists, like Gaddafi observed. There are those who are Christians, and there are those who are Islamic adherents. There are those who are atheists, and all of those have got particular values, and they've got particular, values. I think I need to say that. And therefore, it's a contested, highly contested area. Without digressing, let's just look at the situation, in Rwanda, for instance. In Rwanda, anyone who visits the place, the place is well organized, well run, clean. And if you get off the aeroplane and you get to the outside of the airport, there are no dirty plastics or whatever flying around. And when you get to the place itself, and now reports have been confirming this, that it's as though there had not been the kind of genocide that we know of, which began in 1994. And I will not touch the question of what is happening between Rwanda and Congo in the wars there. But you ask, the question is always, under the rule of the party that is headed by Kagame, Rwanda has moved from one progressive, progressive, achievement to the next achievement. You only need to read what they did when they came to power, in education, all the kind of things that, even Gaddafi regime, concentrated upon. But people are saying, but then that guy is a dictator, man, and he's a killer. Look at the people that, even you in South Africa, you know of a case of a person who was his opponent, who was killed in a hotel in Johannesburg. And of course, no, there hasn't been any evidence, speaking as lawyers only, there hasn't been any evidence that, you know, he was behind this. But the question that really needs to be asked is whether a yardstick for a free society that observes human rights, freedom of choice, and all of those things is one that is modeled on Western democracy. This is something that Professor Nkuhlu raised when his book was launched recently, when he narrated stories about the kingdoms that formed part of our culture in the African continent. Things that have gone lost, have got lost. We no longer have respect for our leaders who happen to be traditional leaders, because there was a declaration of traditional leadership by the imperialists and the apartheid regime, who used those leaders in society, especially in the rural society, for their own ends. So there's still a very big controversy. And it is something that needs a debate of the nature that we're engaging in. Is it a sine qua non? Is it a sine qua non that only Western notions of democracy can give rise to progressive life? Is Kagame, how wrong is Kagame? Of course, you know that there has recently been elections that were announced. I think he got 95 or 90% of the vote. And the question is, if that is what the people of Rwanda want, who are we who are not Rwandans? Who are we to go and question, you know, why 95% of the people, no, they have been terrorized, no, you know what, you know Kagame and what have you. But the fact of the matter is, what has been returned seems to be that the people, 90 or 95% of the people say, we like this guy. Now, who are we as, you know, as outsiders? Who are we to dictate to what the people of Rwanda, you know, have done? Unless, of course, we're going to be told, no, those votes were rigged. But then that's another story. But let's suppose that it is so. It's a reflection of the kind of support that Paul Kagame has. So what does it matter that there are no other political parties who have participated in the thing? In China, for instance, I mean, the Chinese have got this thing about, you know, selection for election. You know, people who get, you know, elected to positions are people who are selected on the basis of the track record that they have. Xi Jinping, before he became the secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, this guy was, you know, he ran what would be a province here, you know. So he was one of 7 leaders who were running, you know, like they would be running a country, who were running the areas or the provinces where they were leaders in a way that caused the Communist Party to say, who then is going to be the Secretary General of the Communist Party, who then becomes the president of these 7 leaders. So election for selection for election. So there is a way in which it is possible to get a genuine reflection of the will of the people. I think we in South Africa must begin to think out of the box. We must begin to say, yeah, for all these years, there's been this democracy, which was not a democracy for us, because since the 1900s, they took our land and they never returned it, like it has not been returned now. And we became beggars in our own land. Now the question is, therefore, that's the question. What is wrong and what is unethical, and irresponsible about a leader who leads for the betterment of his or her people? Isn't that what life is all about? Even our constitution, talks about, the right to life, the right to dignity. Is there anything that subtracts from the dignity of our society or of Rwandan society simply because there is one party, or there was one party, or there was a Kigama who ruled in Kigali, in Rwanda, for the last 30 years? So I mean, I'm just being provocative. I'm throwing it out there.
Of course, definitely. And we appreciate that, Honorable Justice, because a platform like this for scholars, this is definitely what you did. Some of the things probably may not agree with, but just to be a devil's advocate. I acknowledge Dr. Mangisa, and I see a very long note from Dr. Cleopas Sibanda there. Can I just ask these colleagues very briefly, Dr. Mangisa, and then Dr. will be followed by Dr. Sibanda, as I'm saying with due respect, very briefly, and then we'll ask Justice Ntsebeza to respond. Dr. Mangesa, over to you, my brother.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Prof. Majola, and thank you to the esteemed Justice Honorable Adv Dumisa Ntsebeza. We can only drink endlessly from the well, but unfortunately, Prof. Majola, you are putting time constraints from this well, that would have loved to drink more, but what can we do because of time? Well, I take the point that ethical leaders must lead for the betterment of his or her own people. Bear in mind, of the right to life of his people, her people, and the right to dignity. With that, Honorable Justice, I want to take you to the death sentence, that was abolished as a result of the judgment of the state versus Makwanyane, where it was abolished. Where I am moving from as why, in my own belief, it was abolished, and why I advocate for reintroduction of it. I am saying at the time, the prevailing circumstances were that the likelihood would be, if we continue with it, there would be persistent hanging or execution of our Black people, because we're moving from the past, where predominantly those who were hanged were political activists. And moving forward, it was not a palatable scenario, to continue with the death sentence. As a result, there is then a constitution, which, where I am sitting, it is as a result, or it is a social contract because of the circumstances back then. But now, the overall outlook, Honorable Justice, things have changed. Things have changed recently, or now, in the Eastern Cape, 18 people were killed in one day. And I take your point where you are saying, if we continue with the death penalty, chances are mistakes can be made. And I am saying there's got to be mechanisms, to work around those mistakes, to make sure that once, we reintroduce death penalty, then there are mechanisms to make sure that we address these mistakes. And some of the mechanisms, from where I sit, I am saying, once a high court passes a judgment that whoever, has committed these heinous crimes, he is fit for a death penalty. Obviously, that must be appealed automatically, and we get, people of your caliber to argue, until the Supreme Court until the Constitutional Court, and obviously that would be at the coffers of the state to make sure that these mistakes are mitigated or are eliminated altogether. Now, where I am saying, if we don't reintroduce death penalty, chances are these perpetual killings in this current circumstances, it's gonna go on until I don't know where. That's me, Prof. And I would like the Honorable Justice to respond. Thank you so much.
Well, unfortunately, my brother, you have asked the wrong judge, because I am one of two judges who have written dissenting opinions in death sentences that were imposed by a court in Tanzania. You will know that I sit in the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And there are many of these death sentence cases, especially from Tanzania, largely because there was a very unfair piece of legislation where it's the kind of legislation that we had in South Africa, where irrespective of whether there are, extenuating circumstances, when once you have been found guilty by a court in a murder trial or all those kinds that attract capital punishment. The judge has no, it's mandatory in Tanzania. It's mandatory. And in our court, we said, no, this is a violation of Article 3 or Article 4 of the African Charter. You know, we had various, you know, one of the reasons that we felt in South Africa would say it was unconstitutional. One of the reasons we felt that it was, you know, a violation of the African Charter, which guarantees, you know, right to dignity, right to life, etc., was the fact that, you know, the people who get sentenced to death, in most cases, are people who are sentenced to death because Article 4 says it is mandatory for the judge to impose the death sentence the moment the judge, rightly or wrongly, the moment they say you are found guilty of murder and the sentence, then the law there says, then the sentence is the death penalty. And we in the African court felt, nah, this is going way too far. At least a judge must have the ability, you know, to say, yeah, let me see whether there are any extenuating circumstances. You will recall that in South Africa, that was the law. And that was one of the bases on which the law was overturned. So in our court in Tanzania, we have said it can be. If it's an affront, it's a violation of Article 4, the right, you know, to life, and therefore, you know, it is unconstitutional in that sense. That was the case even here. But secondly, and this is my view as a dissenter, is that one can never rule out an error of judgment. The margin of error may be very small, but it is not possible to rule out an error of judgment. So when a judge sits there, the judge must be omniscient in order to be able to determine that everything has been looked at. We are very sure our verdict is the correct one. I mean, to err is human, you know, and even the best judge may have misinterpreted either the law or the evidence. And where then you are going to impose the death sentence, what it means is that the state is the one that now kills. And what are the consequences? The consequences are that an innocent person may be killed by the state through the death sentence. Why? It is because the death sentence is irreversible. There are a number of people who have been convicted because the courts were very, very certain that they were guilty. And then it would go in South Africa to the Supreme Court of Appeal. The Supreme Court of Appeal would say, no, the sentence was correct, conviction and sentence were correct. It goes to the highest court in the land, Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court finds differently. So there is never a certainty as to, whether or not the law, has made provision for any and every eventuality. And therefore, if there is a small chance that there may have been an error of judgment, let the sentence not be of a nature that all that will happen is that those who have lost, a person who has been hanged, a person who has been executed, in whatever way the death sentence is imposed. When once it has happened, it has happened. It's irreversible. When once a person has been executed, or has been hanged, you cannot bring that life back. And the question must in fact be asked. And that's why, for instance, I stand alone and a few others, and with Amnesty International, that the death sentence must be completely abolished. I'm an abolitionist, unfortunately. From those days during apartheid, when we were activists and we were faced the death sentence, to even now, post-apartheid, there is no certainty. But the one thing that is clear is that when once a person has been executed in the name of the law, when the law kills, then you can't bring that person's life back, whatever you discover thereafter to have been an injustice in the imposition of capital punishment. So it's still a hot issue. There are people who are abolitionists like me. There are people who are, retentionists. Like I see that the questioner is. And there are people who one day is a retentionist, the next day is an abolitionist, and then he goes back to becoming a retentionist. Because he says, yeah, look at the gruesomeness of this crime. Like, for instance, the gentleman who says, look at these people, 20 people killed. It's because there's no death sentence. You might find that those criminals do not even know, whether or not they will be sentenced to death. And by the way, I've often said, those people who say it doesn't help sending people to prison because they don't feel the pain. Those people have never been to prison. I can tell you now, prison is not nice. Whether you are, I won't mention names, but prison is not a nice place.
So I don't know what's happening. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I was saying Pastor Mporo said exactly those words after he came out there and said, prison is another place. So he really gave a testimony there. Thanks, Honorary Justice. Very brief there, my brother, Dr. Sibanda, very brief. Over to you, sir.
Okay, I hope I'm unmuted and you can hear me. Great. What I'm going to say is not a question, but just a comment based probably on what I presented the other time and also on what has been presented by Justice Ntsebeza. I believe that ethical and responsible leadership should be leadership that seeks to preserve life and to guarantee peace, safety, and security of the people that are led. And when I look back at our history, I see a lot of ethical leadership that went into place. Actually, I was thinking of when we were colonized. The people who colonized us had guns, cannons, and they'd got motorized stuff, and they could have wiped us off the surface of the earth. And our leaders at that time, they realized that we cannot fight these people. Otherwise, we'll be wiped off. We were going to be finished, all of us. So they decided because of ethical leadership, because of responsible leadership, that they cannot be so irresponsible as to lead and unethical as to lead their people into destruction by these mighty colonialists with guns while we were fighting them with the bows and arrows and spears and knob carries. So because of that ethical and responsible leadership, they decided to submit to the rule of colonizers and said, we will live to fight another day when we are able to do so. And we really lived. That's why we are still around. And we really fought another day in our liberation struggles. And during the liberation struggle, we had some kind of ethical leaders then who were, and responsible leaders who were saying, look, we are fighting for these people to not colonize us. We're fighting for our right to vote, for our right to be recognized on equal terms. And this kind of leadership is focused on that we were supposed to fight for our decolonization, for our liberation, for being treated as equals and not for being racially discriminated against. And we were now capable from the previous days when we were using bows and arrows, knob carries, and all sorts of things. Now we also could use guns and other things. So we could match these people on equal footing. And we managed. Now we are independent. We are politically independent. The next phase of our ethical leadership is fight for economic emancipation, economic freedom. And this is where we are. And with ethical leaders, you see, the leaders pre-colonial gave up their leadership roles to the new leaders who were saying, okay, let's submit to these guys and we'll fight another day when we are capable. So ethical leadership is kind of leadership that knows that I have done my part, I should leave and leave it to the other guys. The other guys were left during colonialism to say, okay, let's go to school, encourage our Black Africans to go to school, to learn, to do stuff for themselves, and then we'll pick up the gauntlet and fight when we can be able to fight. Now we are independent. We need our independent leaders to be ethical and responsible enough to know that they've fought their battle. They liberated us from colonialism. We are now independent. But the next fight, which is an economic liberation, is not for them. They should give it up to the new leaders who actually understand the economic battles, who understand how to emancipate us from economic enslavement, and then we move forward. This is where we have problems in Africa. And at the present moment, that our post-independence, our liberation struggle leaders, they don't want to be ethical and responsible enough to give up their leadership, that they've done their job, they've accomplished the independence they were fighting for, they've liberated us from colonialism, are now independent. They should give the leadership to the you guys who are now going to fight an economic liberation from economic enslavement, exploitation, and so forth and so on. So I wish and hope that our leaders, if they are ethical enough and responsible enough, they should know that they've done their part. They give to the next generation. The next generation does its part, it gives to the following generation. Maybe this economic independent generation will give it to the techno generation in the future, because that will be what the war will be about. Technological advancements, technological warfare, technological this and that. And if you are not there, and if you are not equipped to carry the leadership to that level, give it up to the next generation. So I hope and believe that one day in Africa, our post-independent, our liberation struggle leaders will give it up to the new generation of economic independence or economic freedom leaders, so that we can progress forward. Otherwise, if you want to hang on, and do stuff that you cannot do as a leader, that's not being ethical or responsible. You're actually leading people to destruction. I'll give you an example of my own country where I come from, Zimbabwe, where we have these liberation struggle leaders. We have led Zimbabwe into the quagmire and doldrums of economic destruction after liberating it from colonialism and making it independent. And then their leadership is now not being looked upon as good leadership, and yet it was good leadership because it achieved what it wanted to achieve, which is independence. They took it further. They should have given it up and say, oh, you guys, new guys, come in and do the leadership struggle for economic emancipation. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't disagree with a lot of what has been said. In any event, I mean, Dr. Sibanda said he was not going to be, asking questions. He would make comments. Thank you very much. I take those on board, Dr. Cleopas Sibanda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much, my brother, Dr. Sibanda. Before I ask Professor Zide just to thank the speaker, can I just ask this question, Justice Ntsebeza? Just taking advantage of you because it's very difficult to find you. As the most respected human rights scholar, how would you advise South Africa? How would you advise our country in as far as leadership is concerned? I'm very happy that you touched Rwanda. We always talk about Rwanda's leadership in this platform, in as far as the benevolent dictatorship that is applied there, and the transformational leadership that is applied there. How can someone in South Africa emerge as a leader and change things around within the confines of rule of law and the human rights? Because many people are always say our enemy are these human rights that are really are preventing us each and everything, or each and every time someone would like to introduce something, they'll be taken to court or constitutional court because of rights, as opposed to countries like Rwanda, where really they are not, their culture not as ours in as far as human rights is concerned. So if tomorrow we were to find a leader who would lead like Kagame, obviously in South Africa, there's a rule of law. In South Africa, there's human rights. But at the same time, we envy someone like that who can just come. I always say, even if it was just one term, if in our African language, we say uhlanya, if you can just get uhlanya, or your Trump, someone like a Trump or someone like anyone who will just come for one term, change things around, and then go after that. But unfortunately in South Africa, because of human rights culture and rule of law, is quite difficult. And that's why we find ourselves entangled between this Western culture, African or the Western, yes, and African, whereas in other countries, when they wake up in the morning, they want to change things, they do. What are your thoughts in terms of South African leadership and change things around? And then after that, I'll ask Professor Zide to take over. Over to you, Justice.
Thank you. No, I'll be very short, which is a risk for me. Lawyers never stop talking. Now, the rule of law, I think we need just to go to basics. The rule of law is premised on the efficiency of law enforcement agencies. Where there is no enforcement of the law, within the four corners of the law, then there's chaos. Like somebody once said, if the courts are not going to function as they should, then people are going to go into the street and fight for their rights in the streets. And that is a slippery road to chaos. So let's go back to basics. The rule of these laws, which we say are true, this is true human rights, and they were agreed to by us. There were consultative processes. I know that it may well be argued that no, the time was not enough. I mean, between 1990 and 1994 or 1993, the kind of, government that we were looking forward to was debated ad nauseam by political parties, even political parties who did not believe in CODESA.